When the British Motor Corporation, better known the world over as BMC, launched the Mini in August 1959, far from being the introduction of just another new car, it was the birth of a design classic. More than 40 years on, the Mini has remained fundamentally unchanged, mixing that never-had-it-so-good style with up-to-date technology. The unique character of this delightful little car has inspired artists, brought it starring roles in films, and has won the hearts of millions far and wide. For many of its owners, the Mini evolved as much more than a car. It became a way of life. And today we have the pleasure of exploring how and why this small, seemingly ordinary family car transformed into perhaps the greatest success story the motor industry has ever known. However, before we start on our journey, let's take a few minutes to reveal the events that contributed to the invention of the Mini. The real story of the Mini, quite surprisingly, doesn't start in England at all. Its roots lie with Alexander Arnold Constantine Issigonis, a man born in Izmir, a place on the fringes of the eastern Mediterranean. The exotic Issigonis name was courtesy of his father, a Greek by birth, who later took British citizenship. Young Alec, as the Mini's inventor was affectionately known, set out with a passion for the motoring industry, which emerged during his first job when he spent 5 years collaborating on a design for a semi-automatic gearbox. In 1936, 3 years later, he joined the British car firm Morris under the control of Leonard Lord. During the Second World War, Issigonis remained within the motoring industry, where he worked on several experimental projects, including a lightweight Morris reconnaissance vehicle for the army, and a tiny amphibian craft with an outboard and tiller steering. The latter vehicle had small wheels at each corner, a design feature that Issigonis incorporated into the Mini. In 1948, long after the end of the war, Morris gave Issigonis permission to create his first complete car, and with more than 10 years of motoring experience behind him, he created the Morris Minor. Like its Mini successor, its unit construction body, independent front suspension using torsion bars, and unusually small wheels defied the conventions of the motoring industry. Issigonis wanted to give the Minor front-wheel drive, like its successor, but in 1952, when Morris merged with rivals Austin and BMC was born, Issigonis' services were surplus to requirements. While all this was taking place, the post-war car industry encountered several problems. Cars were no longer reasonably priced. Some family cars began to cost double their original design price, and wartime tax still applied to cars. Unless you were relatively well off, buying a family car was out of the question. The post-war petrol shortage also led to a continuation of petrol rationing. For the private motorist, petrol was rationed to between 6 and 10.5 gallons a month, depending on the car's fuel consumption, which meant a limit of travelling only 300 miles a month for the typical driver. In 1957, Autocar magazine featured motor scooters as alternative transport, but people weren't interested in these ugly-looking machines. The need for a small, economical car was pushed to the forefront of the motoring world, and as a result, the 1950s became the era of both the bubble and microcar. All around Europe, car owners were given the classic Fiat 500, the Renault Dauphine, the Citroën 2CV, the Volkswagen Beetle, and the Austin A30. Despite the cut prices of these cars, like the two-door Austin A30, which was a steal at £475, car owners perceived British vehicles as boring and unexciting. They wanted transport that was much more than just a car, and that's what they got when Issigonis rejoined BMC in 1957 and was set the task of creating a fast, small car. Enter the Mini centre stage. When Sir Leonard Lord brought Issigonis back to BMC in '57, his brief was simple. He had to create a car smaller than the Morris Minor, yet big enough to accommodate 4 full-sized people. It had to be super compact, super economical, super affordable, and, despite all the constraints, be a real car. It was to be a vehicle that used an existing engine from the BMC range and could be ready for production within a 2-year time frame. With his challenge laid out before him, Issigonis set to work on Project AD015, or, as it's more commonly known, the Mini. And the rest, as they say, is history. From the very beginning, Issigonis had decided not to build a bubble car, a decision represented by his choice of dimensions. He looked at the minimum space necessary to comfortably seat 4 people, and decided that the car should be 10 feet long by 4 feet wide by 4 feet tall. Quite remarkably though, when the Mini was launched, it had a substantial amount of internal space, much more than anyone expected from those dimensions. In order for Issigonis to successfully build a car to these specifications, he had to scrap the conventional 3-box shape and overhanging boot. In the finished car, he did manage to fit an adequately sized boot, and the ingenious lid design enabled drivers to fold it down to use as a luggage platform. With the car's overall dimensions and shape clearly defined, a 2-stroke engine was discarded in favour of a more conventional 4-cylinder 4-stroke engine. It was an engine that had already been successfully established in BMC's staple power unit, the A series, used in both the Morris Minor and the A30. At the same time, Issigonis rejected the idea of having a rear-drive car and instead opted for front-wheel drive, an idea he'd previously explored when he designed the Minor. At the time, front-wheel drive cars were actually not uncommon. For example, the Citroën 2CV used this method of driving. But what made the Mini different from other cars was the front-wheel drive layout. Because of its minute size, conventionally mounting the engine lengthways was out of the question. It was simply too big. From this point of view, it would have been logical to turn the engine sideways to transverse it, but again this was not viable as there was no room for the gearbox alongside. Eventually, Issigonis kept the engine transverse, but decided there was enough room to place the gearbox under the crankshaft with the drive unit behind it. In 1957, transverse engines were quite usual, but fitting the engine and the gearbox in such a small space was anything but. In another act of brilliance, he decided to add the smallest wheels that had ever been used on a car, and at a mere 10 inches in diameter, they had to be specially made. However, when prototypes were built, it was necessary for the wheels to be enlarged slightly. These wheels were mounted to the extreme corners of the car so that they didn't intrude on passenger space. fact that they were so small did raise questions as to whether there was adequate space for brakes, and raised concerns about excessive tyre wear. But these questions were all satisfactorily answered, and the wheels were allowed to stay. With the wheel and engine design successfully completed, Issigonis moved on to creating the suspension and drive shaft, both of which were far more challenging to design, as he needed them to be flexible and capable of coping with big changes of horizontal angle. Once again, Issigonis defied motoring conventions, and with the help of his old friend Alec Moulton, developed a suspension using new rubber elements sandwiched between metal cones. It was both lightweight and compact, and amazingly low on production costs, like many of the other groundbreaking features of the Mini. Rather than internal seams, the Mini had simple external ones, as well as external door hinges. It also had sliding windows and cable-pull door releases that were not just cheap, but also became recognised as part of the Mini's unique character. 7 months after the project began, prototypes were built and small changes were made. The most noticeable being the engine size, which was reduced from a 949cc A-series engine to an 848cc. At the time, the management thought that the 949cc was far too fast for such a small car, so by changing the engine, they reduced the top speed by 20 miles per hour. By the end of June 1959, the cars were being produced at a rate of 100 a week, and on August the 26th, a mere 2 years after the project began, BMC launched the Morris Mini Minor and the Morris Austin 7. They were two cars that were virtually indistinguishable and available in basic or deluxe version. Looking back, it's not hard to see why the Mini changed the motoring world forever. It successfully met design specifications, making the car revolutionary, innovative and economical, which is perhaps why for 40 years the car remained essentially unchanged until BMW's new Mini was launched in 2001. At last, Britain had produced a car that could compete with models from abroad. In fact, it was even considered to be better than anything the rest of Europe had to offer. The decade of the bubble and small car brought little competition. For example, the pioneering people's car, the VW Beetle, with great European and US success under its belt, was no match for the Mini. It was only cars such as the Renault Dauphine and the Fiat Nuova 500 that appeared to be more worthy rivals. The Dauphine had real car power, 4 water-cooled cylinders and a top speed of 70 miles per hour, but was 3 feet longer than the Mini. The Nuova could boast that it was smaller, but with only a 479cc engine, it was no genuine match for the Mini's performance or refinement. The British small cars didn't fare much better either. BMC's Metropolitan and Ford's 105e were nowhere near as small or as economically priced as the Mini. Right across the board, no rival had the Mini's overall package. They were simply not as economical, as fast or small, and none handled as well over such a wide range of conditions. It will therefore come as something of a shock that, despite all the advantages, the Mini was lucky to survive its second birthday. The early cars seemed to suffer from serious mechanical problems, the most infamous of all being water leaks, which was so bad that puddles accumulated on the floor and soaked into the carpet, leaving behind an unpleasant smell of damp. What made things even worse was the fact that none of BMC's engineers, including Issigonis, could work out how the water was getting in. It was only after several hours of driving through water splashes that they realised that one of the floor panels had been attached incorrectly. Once this was rectified, thankfully, the leak stopped. Unfortunately, there was another water-related problem, but this time it was to do with the engine. The placement of the engine meant that the distributor and spark plugs were at the front, but as you would expect, the ignition system didn't like water, and the car did tend to drown in it. Fortunately, placing a splash shield between the grille and the electrics easily solved the problem. The Mini suffered from faults in other areas too. The exhaust pipes and wheels would fracture, and the transmission tended to leak oil. But such problems as the ones just listed weren't the main threat to the Mini's survival. It was far more basic. Quite simply, sales were very poor. By the end of 1959, BMC were only producing just short of 20,000 Minis, a figure that was comparatively low when considered along with the rest of the motoring industry. In hindsight, the main reason why it didn't sell was because it was so reasonably priced, and prospective customers were worried that purchasing a Mini would scream out, "Look at us, we're poor." Throughout the 1950s, car and class were inseparable, and as long as the Mini was marketed as a working man's car with a working man's price tag, people weren't going to buy it. In standard trim, it was priced at a meagre £497, undercutting every other real car on the market except for the £419 Ford Popular. The advertising campaigns emphasised the low cost and running economy, things that should have been popular because of the petrol shortage. But car owners weren't interested. They wanted a new car that was classy and socially acceptable. The Mini was seen as neither. However, as the 1960s dawned, it was all change, and the British way of life changed beyond recognition. The swinging 60s were revolutionary, a time of Beatlemania, sexual freedom, fashion, youth culture, riots, and political assassinations. But more importantly for the story of the Mini, it was a glorious decade. Almost as soon as the 60s began, the Mini's popularity was in the ascendancy. The British masses witnessed the Queen take it for a ride around Windsor Park, and Princess Margaret even bought one. Suddenly, the Mini ditched its working man image to become a car that was associated with the aristocracy. It was now socially acceptable and desirable to drive a Mini, and by 1961, sales exceeded 150,000 a year. Behind the scenes, BMC were experiencing problems. There was a flaw in the Mini's profit equation that meant that they were probably losing as much as £30 on each car. Only by bringing the production costs down could they make a profit. However, this didn't stop them launching new versions of the Mini. In 1960, the Mini van was unleashed, as well as a variant of the original cars, the Morris Mini Minor and the Morris Austin 7. It was a half-timbered estate car that was called the Traveller or Countryman, depending upon which badge it had. In September, another Mini was introduced in the form of the Super. It featured fancy oil and water gauges, along with an ignition key starting system. By the end of 1961, BMC had produced another 3 Mini types, much to the delight of the British motoring public. In October, the Riley Elf and Wolseley Hornet emerged with false radiator grilles and luxury walnut dashboards. Nevertheless, it's the last of the long list of Mini versions that year which proved to be the most legendary. Unlike the original, this creation wasn't down to the genius of Issigonis, but stemmed from the brain of the commercial racing constructor John Cooper. As soon as the Mini was launched, he recognised its racing potential. He bought one and straight away replaced the engine. He used one from the same A-series unit, but with a longer stroke that meant it had a capacity of 997cc instead of 850. Cooper wanted BMC to build this modified car so his drivers could race them, but the production costs were too high unless they were made in bulk. As a result, BMC decided to build the car and sell it on the open market, which is how the Mini Cooper was born, changing the Mini from a utility car into a sporting icon. The modified engine wasn't the only thing that John Cooper had changed. The Mini Cooper featured twin SU carburetors, a modified cylinder head and a 3-branch exhaust system. He also swapped the long gear stick for a remote switch and gave the Mini its first ever disc brakes, and at only 7 inches in diameter, they were the smallest in the motoring world at the time. His changes enhanced the original performance by 15 miles per hour and entitled him to £2 for each car they built bearing his name. In 1962, the original Austin Mini 7 dropped the 7 from its name, and the Deluxe and Super versions merged to become the Super Deluxe. By the end of the year, the Mini became even cheaper than its launch price. The April budget brought car tax down by 10%, leaving the car costing only £495, 19 shillings and threepence. This of course only helped to boost the Mini's ever-increasing popularity. Given the immense success of the Mini Cooper, BMC launched the Cooper S in March 1963. It had an enhanced engine capacity of 1071 cc's. Its gearbox was strengthened, the wheels were made wider with better brakes, and the top speed was increased. It beat any of BMC's sports cars speed-wise, enhancing the Mini's reputation dramatically. The need for fast cars in the racing world meant that Cooper S variants came thick and fast. In 1964, 970cc and 1275cc versions of the Cooper S were introduced, and in the same year, BMC launched the Moke, a Jeep-like Mini that generated something of a cult following. March 1965 heralded a great achievement for both BMC and Issigonis when the millionth Mini was produced. In May, the option of an automatic gearbox was introduced, along with reclining seats for the Cooper. In 1966, the Mini won its fourth Monte Carlo Rally, and BMC merged with Jaguar to form British Motor Holdings. By the end of 1967, the Mini's popularity had soared to such an extent that earlier mechanical and sales problems seemed like a distant memory. The new glamorous celebrities of the decade, such as Twiggy and Jean Shrimpton, saw the car as a must-have fashion accessory, which helped sales increase further as people followed in the footsteps of their idols. Yet what really made the car popular wasn't its speed or economy, it was the ability for each model to be unique. The Mini had its own fashion identity, which was incredibly important at a time when fashion was, quite literally, everything. The vast number of accessories available allowed car owners to change virtually anything that they wanted. You could buy accessories ranging from extended throttle pedals, straps to keep the engine down, various racing items, and a spectacular tent that could be mounted on the roof. Even more famous faces were modifying their Minis. Beatles star Paul McCartney owned a Mini Cooper S with discreet modifications, but fellow Beatle John Lennon went psychedelic. The most famous Mini fan of all was probably Peter Sellers, the well-known comedy actor. He not only converted people to the Mini, but also made his own truly spectacular. In 1963, he gave his Morris Mini Cooper to the well-known coach builders Hooper, and what came back was a £1,000 Ultimate Mini. The deeply padded, reclining front seats, beige Connolly leather, electric wind-up windows, traditional woodcloth headlinings, and three-spoke alloy steering wheel made the car look more like a Rolls-Royce. On the outside, it had Bentley style, with Lucas headlights placed above two large front spotlights, as well as additional bumper overrides, special wheel trims, and much more. As you look at these more modern, modified Minis today, you can certainly appreciate just what an impact these mega stars of the past really had on this classic car. By the time the 60s were over, hundreds, if not thousands of people had converted or accessorized their Minis. They were changed in every way imaginable. They were elongated to become stretch limos, pulled upwards to make a double-decker bus, and even changed into a car transporter. The most infamous change was the Union Jack Mini, which appeared at the Montreal World Fair in 1967. Mini festivals at Brands Hatch soon became places where car owners could show off their various conversions. Even though you could do all of this, BMC was still creating versions of their own, and in 1967, when production was close to 250,000, they launched the Mark II. It had a bigger rear window, bigger grille, new interior trim and badges, better seats and bigger lights. BMC didn't stop there, as the legendary Cooper was given an all-synchro gearbox, and the Mini 1000 Super Deluxe was given saloon and estate variants. Even the minivan and estate weren't left untouched. They both gained a 998cc option. Even though there was another threat of an oil shortage, and the British economy was going pear-shaped with the pound being devalued by 14.3%, the Mini was nevertheless unstoppable. From 1968 to 1971, it set new sales records, and once again BMC changed its name when it merged with Leyland Motor Corporation to become British Leyland Motor Corporation. The final year of the decade brought interior door handles, wind-up windows and concealed door hinges for every model. It also brought the Clubman, a Mini with a new, some would say ugly-looking nose, bigger seats, improved trim and a conventional dashboard. Looking back over these 10 years, it's easy to see why the 60s was so glorious for the Mini. Not only had it won a countless number of racing trophies, it had moved from the shadows to become one of Britain's most popular cars, if not the most popular. Even breakdown services and policemen were using Minis. Admittedly, its success so far was due in part to its adaptability and fashionable status, thanks to its famous owners. But various Mini versions ensured that brilliant design also played a significant role. When it was chosen to leap 45-foot gaps and hit ramps at 70 miles per hour in the 1969 film The Italian Job, it became clear. The Mini had become a great British icon. 1970 saw the Mini's popularity and success continue. Compulsory seatbelts were fitted into each car, and famous faces brought the car to the front of the society pages. Actor Lawrence Harvey's 1275 Cooper S combined performance with luxury at a staggering cost of £3,000. He had it rebuilt by darkening the windows, inserting a sunroof, and fitting it with leather seats, doors and dashboard. However, from 1970 onwards, the Mini's success and popularity began to take a gentle tumble. Compared to the 60s, the 70s were miserable. Britain was a place of strikes, inflation, unemployment and the IRA. The Beatles had split up, and the youth of the 60s, car owners that had once bought the Mini because it caught their imagination and was fun, were growing up and buying Volvos and Range Rovers to display their wealth and status. Already losing sales to more grown-up cars, despite the 1971 slash in purchase tax, BLMC made a very big mistake. Back in 1961, when John Cooper devised the Mini Cooper, he cut a deal that entitled him to £2 in royalties per car. 10 years on, and the new MD of BLMC, the ruthless Sir Donald Stokes, naturally didn't appreciate paying royalties, and as a result, terminated Cooper's association with BLMC, and any car bearing his name was scrapped. Stokes replaced the 1275 Cooper S, a car responsible for a large number of Mini sales, with the 1275 GT. He might have saved £2 in royalties, but lost far more credibility than he could ever have imagined. The 1275 GT had a single carb 60 brake horsepower engine and a big-nosed clubman shape. It was nowhere near as stylish as the Cooper S, which was clearly reflected in the sales figures. For the next 2 years, BLMC modernised driveshaft joints and gearboxes, making gear changing smoother. In 1973, alternators replaced dynamos, and the management at BLMC wanted the Mini to be made more commercially viable. To achieve this, tinted glass, reversing lamps, locking petrol caps, bumper and wheel arches were all added. But did this make more people want to buy the Mini? The answer was no. In trying to make the car more upmarket and to give it greater appeal, they achieved the complete opposite. By now, it was obvious. They simply didn't understand what it was that made the Mini a classic icon. In 1973, the British economy was struggling, and the threat of a petrol shortage loomed large. By rights, the economical Mini should have taken advantage of the situation with its low running costs. Unfortunately, the car wasn't marketed in that way, and because of this, and the changes that Sir Donald Stokes had made, foreign imports began to outsell BLMC's cars in Britain for the very first time. As the 70s wore on, BLMC management continually tried to make the car more upmarket. By the end of the year, petrol prices had virtually doubled. But yet again, thanks to management's short-sightedness, the Mini failed to take advantage. Instead, inflation pushed the price of the car through the roof, and for the first time ever, the Mini's list price went over £1,000. For BLMC, it was only the beginning of their woes, and as the company was nationalised, the infamous reign of British Leyland started. Unfortunately, bankruptcy was rife throughout Britain, and BL were very soon on the verge of it. In fact, the company and the Mini only survived because of government ownership. Even with the threat of insolvency on the horizon, BL didn't change their marketing strategy. For instance, in 1976, a twin steering column, heated rear windows, hazard lights and face ventilation were all made standard for the Mini 1000. They even introduced special edition Minis that were reminiscent of the glory days. The first one to be released was the 1000 Special. It had coach-lined green and white paint, reclining seats and safari carpets. But the general consensus was that instead of being upmarket, it was just plain tacky. Car owners were no longer interested in the same vehicle that they'd driven 10 years ago. In hindsight, if BL had kept the Cooper while reading the ever-changing marketplace more effectively, perhaps record sales for the Mini could have been regained. However, that said, the Mini sales did rally slightly in 1979. To celebrate its 20th birthday and to bring an unhappy decade to a close, BL launched the Mini 1100 LE. It proved to be an instant hit with metallic roof, door stripes, tartan trim and 1275 GT style instruments. Production was doubled from 2,500 to 5,000, even though the list price was a staggering £3,300. Another Mini that met with success was the Mini Van. It remained the UK's best-selling small van with 10,000 sales a year, and to mark its success, BL made cloth seats, carpets and sound insulation standard in the 998cc model. Yet, instead of the Mini thriving as it had done in the 60s, the sales of the Mini Van and the 1100 LE merely ensured that it survived. For the 1980s, it was a trend that was set to continue, and throughout the decade, BL continued to carry out mechanical improvements, as well as creating a variety of special editions. Designer names like Chelsea, Ritz, Piccadilly and Park Lane were all part of another attempt to make the car more upmarket, classy and appealing. Other specials included the Advantage, which had a tennis theme, the Sprite, Red Hot and Jet Black. However, mechanical reliability was poor, and Mini owners became far too well acquainted with the AA and the RAC. Thankfully, 1980 saw the discontinuation of the unpopular Clubman shape. In the same year, BL came up with a car that they hoped would be the Mini's successor, but a last-minute management decision meant that it would be a new Mini model instead. In October, the Mini Metro was launched, and by the time 1983 rolled around, the Metro had become Britain's best-selling car. Even though the Metro was successful, it was too little, too late. The Mini was no longer fashionable, and as a result, BL's Mini production had fallen below 50,000 a year. Things were looking bleak for the once revolutionary car as the 20th century came into its final decade. Surprisingly, fighting competition from the Japanese manufacturers in Britain, the Mini survived because of its own overseas success. In Japan, the Mini had become a hot motoring fashion item, and they simply couldn't get enough of the delightful little car. In 1986, when BL Cars merged with Honda, they asked John Cooper to produce a performance kit for the 1-litre version of the Mayfair, and his decision to accept the challenge ensured that when BL and Honda became the Rover Group, he would be reinstated. Winning back John Cooper was certainly a very good omen for the Mini's future. In 1989, the Mini celebrated its 30th birthday with a party at Silverstone. Rover asked John Cooper to produce a Mini Cooper to mark the event, and after seeing it in the flesh, so to speak, Rover immediately realised what they'd been missing, and straight away they changed production Minis into Coopers. In 1990, the Mini Cooper was officially returned, closely followed by the Mini Cooper S in 1991. The relaunch of both Cooper models marked the end of new Mini versions until 1999. When the new Mini Cooper was launched, it became the star of the range, selling over 1,000, with a further 600 cars being produced each week. It was an instant success and proved just how wrong Stokes had been when he withdrew the model nearly 20 years earlier. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the Mini was back in the hands of a team that understood it. Nevertheless, these were challenging times, and early in 1994, Honda bought the Rover Group from British Aerospace at a knockdown price. Almost straight after this move, BMW, with its rapidly expanding collection of car brands, bought it from Honda. Immediately, they recognised that the Mini brand could offer them something their other brands lacked, namely sheer volume. It was a brand that had the potential to up the company's turnover and open up a new area of the market for them. Unlike BMW's already existing luxury rear-wheel drive models, the Mini would be small and cheap, while still undeniably enjoying classic car status. It also had the advantage of bringing down the corporate average fuel economy, which was very good news for BMW. Failing to meet the target set meant penalties and harming the environment, and BMW had never been known for prioritising maximum miles to the gallon, with performance being far more important. It was clear BMW had many reasons to cherish and nurture the Mini name, as it clearly had the potential to make them a lot of money. As a result, 1995 saw the engineers and design teams no longer looking at revamping the 1959 classic. Instead, their attention was focused on creating a radical new Mini, one that lived up to its predecessor. To be distinctive and mechanically advanced, whilst retaining the essence and character of the original. It was definitely a tall order, particularly since neither Rover nor BMW had ever worked on small cars that were mini-sized before. In BMW's case, 2 concept cars, the E1 and Z13, can sum up their attempts to manufacture a small car. Both were more concerned with minimum emissions rather than minimum size. As soon as the project began, Rover found it difficult to come up with a new design that did justice to Issigonis' creation. But when 3 cars emerged in quick succession, it was clear that they had the Mini's spirit in mind. The first, in January 1997, was the ACV30, which was unveiled at the Monte Carlo Rally. The car celebrated the 30 years that had passed since the Mini completed its Monte Carlo Rally winning hat-trick in the 60s. Its rear-engined, classic red and white Cooper stripes offered people clues as to what the new Mini would look like. The emergence of the Spiritual and Spiritual 2 gave the masses even more of a hint, especially since they carried the Mini badges. Even Autocar magazine devoted pages of photos to these cars under the headline, "Mini's Big Future, It's Small, Spacious, Cute and Revolutionary." So, had the Mini at last turned a corner? Unfortunately, the answer was no. Unbeknown to Rover, while they were producing and designing these cars, BMW had already decided that no matter what Rover had to offer, the final proposal as to what the new Mini would look like would come from them. As a consolidation prize in 1996, BMW decided that Rover would develop the car and be given maximum freedom with regards to its engineering. Despite Rover's contribution to the final product, in 2000 BMW sold the Rover Group because it was not economically viable. Just like the original Mini, BMW followed in the footsteps of Issigonis, using the minimum exterior dimensions for the maximum interior space. But because times had changed since 1959, making safety and comfort critical, it was impossible to keep the next generation Mini quite as small as the classic was. The inclusion of the old distinctive windscreen angle, round headlamps, smiley grille shape and contrasting colours made the design scream Mini. Not only did BMW want the car's exterior to reflect its predecessor, they also wanted the mechanical design and handling too. It was for this reason that the new car had an improved 4-cylinder, 16-valve, 1.6-litre transverse engine and front-wheel drive. The suspension was updated so that it used strut front suspension with steel coil springs and a version of BMW's 2-axle at the rear. Meanwhile, the interior design had many of the classic Mini styling cues with centered instruments, rows of toggle switches and stylized steering column stalks. By the end of 1997, Rover had prototypes on the road. They made BMW realise that they had to make the car both lighter and more powerful, and that's exactly what happened before the new Mini appeared in 2001. The Mini 1 was available at £10,300 and the Mini Cooper at £11,600. Both prices were a far cry from the 1959 launch price of £497. The new cars were essentially spawned from the same design, like the Austin 7 and Mini Minor, but they had slight differences. The Mini 1 had 90 brake horsepower, a top speed of 115 miles per hour, and did 0 to 60 mph in 10.9 seconds. The new Cooper offered just that little bit more, with 115 brake horsepower, a top speed of 125 miles per hour and 0 to 60 in 9.2 seconds. The cars were instant hits, as both Mini enthusiasts of old and style-conscious buyers of the new millennium wanted to get their hands on one. Soon after the new Cooper was launched, BMW capitalised on its success by releasing the all-new Mini Cooper S in early 2002. It was more flamboyant than the Cooper model, with its bonnet scoop, side vents, bigger wheels, roof spoiler and twin exhausts. Like the old Cooper S, it was a small, sporty car that on the road was reliable, exceptionally economical and powerful. The new Minis were everything that BMW had promised they would be, and although they didn't quite reinvent the small car as the original had, the classic DNA combined with modern technology, performance, safety and quality ensured that the Mini would once again be a success. In fact, it guaranteed that the Mini, ancient or modern, will forever remain a great British icon, undoubtedly deserving its 1995 title as Car of the Century. As our time looking at how the Mini has travelled through the past 40 plus years, emerging as a survivor, an icon, and the best-selling British car ever is sadly drawing to a close, we'll conclude the proceedings with a glimpse of how this new generation Mini is performing. Before the car was even launched in the United States, Americans knew what the Mini was. In the 60s and 70s, about 10,000 classic Minis trickled into the country, and the nation never forgot the extraordinary little car. In fact, people still saw the personality of the original when they looked at BMW's new Mini Cooper and Cooper S. It might not have had a US heritage, but owning one of them was definitely something to be proud of. The Cooper list price was $16,300, with the Cooper S being slightly more expensive at $19,300. Almost immediately, waiting lists were huge as people of all ages were buying the car. Some because of its association with the rich and famous, some because of its amazing drivability, but equally many others were buying the Mini to satisfy the concept of real motoring. It gave people the chance to simply have fun behind the wheel, and with all the pressures, on or off the road, of 21st century life, this was a great asset indeed. After its American success, the new Mini soon became available in Europe. Around the world, sales were so strong that BMW were actually worried that they'd not be able to produce enough Minis to meet the demand. The Mini's worldwide success ensured that awards started to flow. In 2002, it received Car of the Year from magazines in Britain and America, and in 2003, the Mini Cooper was named North American Car of the Year at the Detroit International Auto Show. On the form of the past 40 years, it's hard to imagine what the future holds for a car that wasn't expected to last 10 years, let alone close to 50, and still counting. In the 60s, the Mini's phenomenal success and popularity would have made it impossible to predict that the 70s and 80s would prove to be so tough for our revolutionary little car. BMW insist that the new Mini isn't just one car, but a brand, which can only mean that other versions are to come, led by a Mini convertible variant. They are adamant the Mini will remain in the motoring world for many years to come. And if the enthusiasts who've allowed us a glimpse of their much treasured Minis throughout the course of this programme are anything to go by, BMW have got it right. The foreseeable future for the Mini is indeed bright, and even if the time does come for this eponymous classic to enjoy a well-earned retirement, there's one thing you can be absolutely certain of. The Mini will never be forgotten, because it is as much a part of world history as it is a great little car that people simply love to drive.